Welcome to Fairy Tale Access, where the head fairy's quest is to prove that fairy tales do exist in actual time rather than once upon a time. Together, we will unravel the heroes, young and old, who turn dreams into reality. These are the people who still believe in happily ever after. The discoveries will bend even our most cynical non-believers into believing in fairy tales. Hi, welcome to Fairy Tale Access. Today, my guest is Linda Peck. She's an educational professional who works with coaching in the areas of mindfulness and how we interact with others and what our body language tells us. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. It's lovely to be here.
My pleasure, Linda. Okay, so tell us a little bit about what you do.
Okay, well, it all began years ago when I started to be able to see that there are ways in which you can learn and integrate information, access knowledge, and apply it. It's very different from the way that we do it today. And in that said, the way that we identify ourselves today in our technological world is through our media, our social media. And when I teach either students or I train administrators or corporate clients, I talk to them about how it is that we can get all our lives into those little black boxes, because that isn't our lives. And what we do is we live our lives through computers, through social media, and we don't focus or we aren't mindful or aware of other areas that are important and integral to our learning.
So when we say mindfulness, what do you mean exactly?
Mindfulness is a way of accessing who you are and assessing who you are, as well as assessing others, how you, as you said, how you interrelate with the world at large and with yourself, how you, how it is that you reframe or redirect situations, responses, and interpret information. Because a lot of times the way that people speak to you, you interpret it very differently than what they're intending.
Well, that's true. So how does art play into what you do?
Well, I got my start in art as a mime. And was
As a mime?
Yes, and performed all over the world. And that, when I started to study mime, I realized that mime is all part of believing. It's not imagining that the wall is there. It's believing that it's there. And a good mime will let you believe that it's there as well. So from that strain of thought, or that thread, came the idea that if you can believe that you can understand or even invent or be creative within your learning paradigm, then you will be. For instance, Van Gogh, he believed that 100 years before Hubble was invented, he painted Starry Night. And no one knew there was a galaxy of stars up there. We couldn't see it. But it was there, and he knew it. In some sense, he intuited it, sensed it. And so the senses are very important in the way that we relate to information, the way that we relate to the world.
Oh, how do you explain that to children? What kind of techniques do you use when you're talking with children about these issues?
It's an abstract concept, yes. Well, children amazingly are very, they're really intelligent, and they're also they lead with their senses in many ways. So they understand the idea that if I'm going to ring a singing bowl, that they can still hear the sound of the bowl even when it's not still ringing anymore, because the vibrations are still within you or within us. And so they still sense the feeling and the sense after the sound stops, that it's still there. And then I talk to them a little bit about, okay, so you sense it, but what are those senses? And I talk to them about distinguishing between qualities and characteristics. So they learn that that actually bridges the gap. It's a disciplinary bridge or link to art because you can see that in art, in pictures, in paintings, qualities and characteristics are very different.
Mm-hmm.
A quality of a painting is what it emanates, what it makes you feel, think about, desire, love. A characteristic is, does the person in the painting have a large nose? Do they have a big head, big ears? So students learn a lot about how to discriminate or discern information and distill it through art.
Wow. When you're talking to children, how long do you usually spend with them?
Well, it depends. I am funded through the New England Foundation for the Arts, as well as a wonderful organization called Arts for Learning Connecticut and Hartford Performs. All three of those organizations put me into schools, or I do professional development for teachers. And so I can spend anywhere from a whole year with students to one day.
Wow.
So, and that's called backward design. And in education today, what we do is we isolate between the arts and academics.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm here today to talk to you about is the imperative for embedding it within academic competencies, because art is not something that should be isolated. It's part of how we learn.
Exactly. So how does it fit in with the new Common Core style of teaching?
Well, because I have a master's in arts integration, I demonstrated some examples to you earlier about Van Gogh.
Mm-hmm.
And so I teach that. Another thing that I teach is I teach a physics of circus, because I do some circus skills, and motion and mindfulness. So when I talk about motion and mindfulness, you can say, well, how can you make the connection between the two? Well, within motion, there's stillness. There's stillness in motion. And mindful, to be a mindful person and to live in a mindful way, you need to have stillness within your motion. You need to take those chaotic, swirling thoughts and learn how to slow them down. In mime, it's called isolation to integration. So when you study mime, you first learn to move your head and your neck in various modalities, really, and you isolate every muscle. So you isolate, and then eventually you put it together and you integrate it.
Wow.
And they do it on the streets today. They call it hip hop, but it's modern day break dancing. And they like that.
Wow. So the kids must love that.
They do. They really, and not only do they love it, they listen, they observe, they access information on a totally different path. They learn in such a different way. And you can actually see it happening and unfolding.
How does it teach them to make connections?
Well, for example, it'll link math, it links science, it links literature. I teach sign language, and it's like poetry with your hands. So what I do is I teach them, I'll take a poem like Emily Dickinson's poem, Dwell in Possibilities. So then I teach them that, and then I make a connection to the Chinese word for unification, actually not unification, the Chinese word for crisis as well as opportunity. The Chinese word for opportunity also means crisis. So
Really?
yes, it does. Yes, they're one and the same. So for the sign language people, this means intelligence. It also means a thought. It means possibilities. It has many different meanings. So students can see that they can actually integrate information within their body as they move, and they can also understand it through a mind-body connection, a holistic approach. And the Chinese teach that. The Chinese have an education paradigm or methodology or pedagogy that is based in mindfulness. So they don't separate art and mindfulness. For example, I teach children how to do Chinese brush painting. And you can't hold on too tightly, and you can't hold on too loosely to the bamboo brush. If you do, the character won't come out. And so I teach them a little bit about holding on and letting go. So they learn that life is a paradox. And the paradox in life is what makes life so interesting. It's what makes creativity happen. It's what makes us be able to think beyond human awareness.
It's amazing. And is it Tai Chi that you also do?
Yes, I teach Tai Chi. I have a certification from a master from China, actually from 5 of them.
Wow.
Yeah, well, I was tested by 5 Chinese masters and learned a lot of my mindfulness training from them, from Master Jesse Sao, who was my master. And I learned a lot by watching Chinese people, how they walk, how they went at the store. I observed a lot. I was very interested in mindfulness early on because I knew that there was a large connection between mindfulness and learning and art.
Mm-hmm.
Artists believe that beyond the painting, you have to see beyond it. Painting is not only a mirror for us to reflect a society, it's also what's beneath it. And we have to be able to see what's behind the mirror, not only through it.
Oh, that's true. That must really help your teachers.
It does. It really does. That's very insightful of you to say that.
What type of techniques or examples do you use with your teachers when you're explaining how, to engage the classroom, to be able to express themselves not only vocally and visually, but using their body language to bring the whole group together?
Well, I teach them some Tai Chi motions because when your body is flowing and when you're doing motion, like slow motion Tai Chi movements, it helps your circulatory system. So your brain, it's called proprioception, your brain and your body are firing on all levels. So you're really engaged on all levels. So I have them doing that. And then I give them proprioceptive ideas on how to teach their children. I give them exercises for them to do before they start any academic competency or course standard. So before they go into a math equation or a science property or poetry, they do these exercises, they're breathing, they scan their bodies. There's lots of exercises that I actually created on my own, and I'm writing a book right now called Thinking Inside, Outside, and Beyond the Box.
Sounds great. Good concept.
Thank you, yes, yeah. And hopefully I'm hoping as well, I worked with Cigna, and I've worked with Hewlett-Packard years ago, and General Electric, a number of corporations. And I really appreciate working with business people because I do feel like it helps them in their everyday connections with one another. It helps them reframe and redirect things that are going on in the office that may be adverse. Mm-hmm. It helps them manage one another in ways that are respectful and effective. So for corporations, I am more like an effective education coach or a mindfulness officer.
Wow, how large are the groups that you speak with? Like the smallest to the largest?
The smallest are about 30. I've had 30. And the largest have been 400.
Wow.
I had 400 business people, women and men in suits, up and doing Tai Chi, as well as working with some proprioceptive ideas that they can use in their offices when they go back to their offices.
And looking at your website, which is really interesting, by the way, I noticed that one of the activities you do is tightrope walking. What is that about?
Well, when I studied mime, I also studied circus arts, and because they're all interrelated, they're sensory modalities. It all has a lot to do with balance, internally and externally, as well as where you put your focus and attention. So if you're putting your focus down, you're going to go down. And that's another concept that I teach teachers and corporate clients about positive psychology and looking out, not down.
Wow, is that the whole trick to walking a tightrope?
Well, there's a lot more. There's practice.
Of course.
There's something in circus jargon. There's something called corrections, and you use that in balancing in many different areas of life. You make corrections, and it's not a bad thing to make corrections because you learn that if you go too far to one side or too far to the other, that you're not going to achieve your goal. And that can be interpreted across disciplines, in business, in education, in psychology, across every discipline that we know of.
That's fantastic. Okay. So what have we missed? So what are the connections between the body and the mind? So the way that you're incorporating these visual, physical elements, and how does it cross over to the way that you're thinking about doing things?
Okay, well, that is a very good question. And it's actually when people sometimes, when they first walk into my trainings or my seminars or else my residencies where I teach for students, they're shaking their head or they're just, they're scratching their heads wondering, how is this all going to work? And the way that it works is I have you put your mind in your body so you feel through your mind and you think through your body. So I have it reversed. And in essence, what you're doing is you're letting go of thought in order to find it. So you're isolating thought from your body in order to be able to integrate it into your mind and your body together. So I'm slowing down the thought process with the techniques. I call them devices or gestures. In Tai Chi, they call them gestures. The ones that I invented are more like devices or techniques. And they're evidence-based. I've been working on them for over 36 years.
Wow.
And I've made IEP assessments on students. I have graphs on the changes that students' brains, how they were rewired and reframed. And I have examples, lots of examples. I'll give you one. I was at a school where I was watching, I had come a little early. I wanted to watch the children. And they were playing soccer. And they had a goalie on either side and a net. And one child came up from one side of the room and the other came up from the other. And so, and they would take turns. So they were all running up, trying to kick the ball in. And one girl walked up, she took a breath, and she kicked the ball, and it was the only one that went into the net. Nobody else, everyone kicked it all over the gym. It's because what she was doing is she was making space in her mind and her body for her to be able to believe that that ball could go into the net, and that she had the capability to make that happen. And if it didn't happen at first, it would eventually.
So it's integrating the social, emotional, physical, and the academic.
Competencies. Yes, it is. It's multidisciplinary, and it's a layered, scaffolded approach to learning. It's also, I know that Steve Jobs did it to invent, his corporation. I know that Tesla was invented in that way. The Chinese invented the printing press 100 years before we did because they took a cider press, it pressed apples, and they tinkered with it. They didn't say, oh, I have to do this. They didn't rack their brains. They didn't push themselves to try to invent it. And they just took it very slowly and they tinkered with it. And they invented it way before we did. And they tend to invent a long time way before we do. They invent lots of technology for Americans.
Wow, that's a really good concept and a really good way to think about it and break it down. It seems so simple, but
it does seem simple.
It does.
But that's our paradox. It's simple but complex.
Exactly. Wow. So what are some of your best examples of how it's worked in the office, in the classroom.
I'll give you a wonderful example. I worked with a high school in Connecticut for a whole year with students, and they were all very excited about what we were doing. There was some students in there that were also on the chess team, and they said they thought it was really effective, a lot of the techniques we were learning. And there was one boy, Gabe, and he was not as well, the students looked at him in a way that he was inferior to them. He wasn't. He was just different. He saw the world in a different way. And so he didn't push to try to learn some of the circus skills I was teaching, or the mime, or even the Tai Chi. He just let it happen. He learned some of the movements, and he watched a lot. He would stand on the side and observe me doing it at first, and a lot of the other students, they would just rush in and say, I want to do this, I want to do this. And Gabe wouldn't do that. So I tested them. I had a challenge at the end. I have a rubber ring, and I took everyone outside, and I flung the rubber ring up into a branch of the trees, fairly high. And I asked them to get it down. So they found some branches of some trees to try to knock the branch down, and of course it wouldn't come down. And Gabe had the right idea about how to do it. He went over to the tree, and he actually tried to shake the tree himself. And then what he did is he had the students bend over and create like a triangle.
A pyramid.
Exactly, thank you, a pyramid. And he stood on their backs, and he got it down. And none of the other students thought of that. They just didn't think of it. So, and everybody applauded Gabe, and they were all excited that Gabe had thought of it. And he was watching them all try to get it down for a long time. They took other rings. I had other rings and tried to throw the ring to get it down. And it wouldn't work. And in my corporate...
So it's a good way to show how to work as a team.
It is. It definitely is. Yeah. And Gabe was the leader, much to everyone's surprise, because they all thought, oh, Gabe, he's a little slow. So, and in my corporate experiences, when I was at Cigna, I had a wonderful thing happen. I was there for a health day, a family health day. And so the business people brought their children in. And I was doing some performing. And while I'm performing for the children, I was doing some mime. All the business people had their computers on their lap, and they're typing, and they're not watching me. So I started to do some fun mime where I'd come over and I'd go like this or like that, and I would, or else I would pull something out of their ear and, like that, or do something funny. And they all, one by one, started closing their computers. And by the end, there were like 500 people there. By the end, all the computers were closed and put away. And I had everyone up doing Tai Chi and some mindfulness movements.
Oh, that must be fulfilling.
It was terrific. Even little kids, 5-year-olds, were doing it as well and liking it.
Awesome.
It, yes.
So how did you get involved in this to begin with? What made you decide to become a mime?
I was always interested in the idea that silence really spoke to me. It spoke to me because I loved ballet and dance when I was young, and skating. And I had quite an excellence in a lot of physical skills. And I liked tennis, I liked anything movement-oriented. And so I often thought that the silence is within your capability of how you interpret that art form. It's very silent, the way you access information. It's within you. It's inside. And
It's true.
Bringing the inside out, I call it bringing the insight out.
Excellent. And your favorite book of all time growing up?
Oh, growing up? Oh, well, I would actually have to say Mary Poppins.
Wow, that was such a good book.
It was a wonderful book, very different than the movie. In fact, they had some physics within it. About they had the kite that Michael used was in the shape of a pie form, a physics pie form, which I thought was interesting. And Mary Poppins was an interesting teacher. I think that was where I sort of got my start, because I thought that the way that she interpreted the world had a lot to do with being mindful about it. And I always ask people, I do this in corporations, did Mary Poppins come for the children, or did she come for the parents, or are they there for her? So there is a cross current in that story.
Absolutely.
So I believe when I was young, I loved poetry too. My mom used to read poetry to me, and Emily Dickinson was a favorite too as well, because her poetry is very graphic.
It is.
One of my favorites is Hope. Hope is like a hope. Well, anyway, forget that. We'll have to edit that part.
Okay. So, well, thank you so much for joining us. All right. So is there anything that we forgot to tell our audience?
Yes. Well, I'm really looking forward to being able to create a mindfulness climate and culture within various communities, corporations, administrations, schools, and even throughout Europe as well. I'm looking into working there as well, and I'm hoping to be able to make the world a more mindful place.
Sounds great. Can't wait for your book. That's going to be exciting. All right. Until next time, keep asking questions. The answers are out there. Sometimes you just have to be silent. See you soon.